Now we got to get to work. I would like to invite to the stage, or welcome to the stage, my two colleagues, both senior fellows here at the DFRLab, the inimitable Ben Nimmo and Andy Carvin.
От любой, даже самой ничтожной мелочи можно протянуть цепь логических рассуждений.
First question for the floor. How many of you recognize that iconic piece of Soviet film? Hands up. A few of us here? Okay, so that is Vasily Livanov in the 1980 Soviet version of The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. Possibly the finest Sherlock Holmes of all time. And he was made an honorary member of the British Empire for his acting. You can go to the Baker Street Museum and see a statue of him. Sherlock Holmes is an iconic figure in his own right.
Do you want to translate for those who didn't understand?
Indeed, yes, I do apologize. So for those who are not Russianists, what Holmes is saying at that moment is a line from the very first Sherlock Holmes story, where he's saying that from even the smallest piece of evidence, you can draw a chain of deductive reasoning and you can arrive at the solution to the crime. And we feel that that's kind of iconic, and that's really what we try and do in all our work.
And well, it's easy to think of Sherlock, as a character at least, as being a Renaissance man, a bit of a misanthrope. I'd also argue that he's one of the original open source researchers. If you've read any of his stories, seen any of the many adaptations of them, he literally can sniff clues out of the air. There's no way, of course, he would have been using terms like open source, but he was observing the world around him and seeing what he could pull out of it to deduce and ultimately find proof to the crimes he was trying to solve. And so, it wasn't called open source back then, but yet, in some ways it was. But I would also argue that there are probably some of you in this room who are like, well, that's not exactly true. You're just kind of trying to find a Sherlock metaphor to fit into all of this. And I think that's totally fair, because we're all coming from different disciplines, different backgrounds, and all have very different thoughts on what it means to be working in open source. So we're going to put you on the spot. Over the next 2 minutes, we would like you to talk to the people at your tables and come up with a working definition of open source that is one sentence or less. And on top of that, we also want you to come up with an example of something that is open source, and it better be creative, because if you say a tweet, we're walking off the stage. So please, you've got 2 minutes. Define open source and come up with an interesting example of something that is open source. And the clock starts now.
Free, that's true, can't pay for it. Absolutely.
1 minute down, 1 to go. Come on, people, work it.
Okay, let's think of anything creative.
Let's see how they listen.
What would you have thought was open source that they thought was so interesting?
We're doing DFRLab using open source for us. Yes. We take
Identifying
information,
themselves.
pictures that
30 seconds. Tick tock, tick tock.
Okay, Russians always tell me.
We're coming to you.
That's it. Because then you look at the mountain behind them, right? Like,
Or
and
some
the building.
insignias upstairs.
And 10, 9. Well, you know the rest.
And it's not a tweet, it's on Instagram. We'll follow that on Facebook stories.
Can everyone hear that? Your 2 minutes is up. I should probably shut that off too. All right.
Okay, so how many tables think they have a definition? Hands up if you've got a definition.
Hands up, everyone. Who's got a working definition? Let's go here.
Can we have a mic? Next table. Next table.
Okay, we'll do that table first, but this table next then, please.
Open source, that's information that's accessible but not classified in any particular jurisdiction.
Okay. And do you have an example of something specific, or does that answer it as well, do you think?
Maritime ship tracking data.
Good.
Yep.
All right. You guys next, then we'll come over here.
Making information available for masses or providing information for masses. It's classified, non-classified, any kind of information. And the example we have is Flight Radar 24. Flight Radar 24.
Oh, right. Yes, of course.
Okay. Very good. So we got ship tracking, we got flight tracking.
What do you have over here? Back here, please.
So we think that open source is any information that is publicly available. It might be hard to find, but you can find it. And one form might be public land records, like your county assessor database.
Let's do a couple more. Anyone? You guys had your hands up right here. Yep.
Yep.
Well, let's try to get someone over here then.
And we'll go down here.
Oh, we can do them too.
Well, I would say that the open source is everything basically you can find on the Google.
Fair enough.
Just on Google, Yandex, Bing.
We're actually going to do two more. This table had its hands up, and then we promise we're not going to ignore this
We
quadrant.
agreed with the definitions we had so far, but we added modifiable. We don't think just being public was enough to be open source.
Modifiable.
And we thought of lots of examples. Reddit, we thought, and but we didn't think that just being public was enough.
So public and findable.
Good. Over here, please. One last one.
So we think that open source is the data that you can find, but to find it, you really need to know what you want to find. And examples, we could say that those 5,000 cases of East Stratcom, so there are 5,000 patient zeros that you need to find, and it's a really hard job.
So I'm getting a sense around the room that there are a lot of similarities, but some differences as well. And that makes perfect sense, given we have people here who have a background as technologists in free and open source software, for example, open source researchers, people who are into open government and open government data, and the list could go on. But if I had to, I think we can probably find a few commonalities. So, for example, there's transparency. When it comes to open source, whether it's the data that you're trying to work with or the methodologies you're trying to use, transparency is absolutely key, because without it, it can't be replicated. And I think one of the most important aspects of the work we do is that we don't stand up and say, trust us. We are willing to say, here's the evidence, here is our proof, here's our methodology, walk yourself through it. So any critic out there, if they want to say, oh, we're politically biased about this or that, they still have to deal with the fact that there is evidence being put on the table, proof that can be replicable. And lastly, that leads to accountability. Of course, we don't want to screw up, but if we do screw up, we want to know how we did it and why we did it. And one of the wonderful things about this community, I think, is the way we're always serving as a form of both formal and informal peer review. All of these things, in one way or another, come together as part of the type of open source work we all do. And in many ways, you could make the argument that it's essentially a form of the scientific method, something not far off from what Sherlock Holmes himself would have embraced back in the day, if he had been a real human being, of course.
And the wonderful thing is, based on all that you said, it really opens up how many different sources of open source there are. I was at a conference in South Africa a year and a half ago, shout out to Chris Roper from Code for Africa, where a local researcher had done amazing work simply by collecting the discarded paper receipts from shops in his neighborhood and had used those to build up a pattern of economic activity in the town. So this is literally little pieces of paper lying on the ground that he'd collected, collated, analyzed, studied, turned into an enormous spreadsheet, and then started playing with. Back in the days of Sherlock Holmes, you would have had receipts like this from the late 1890s. It's a piece of paper which says how much was spent, where it was spent. Now, nowadays, you think a lot of what we're doing is digital, right? We talked about Google, we talked about Reddit, but we can still talk about pieces of paper. For example, the Dutch police last April arrested a team of what they suspected were hackers from Russian military intelligence, the GRU. And wonderfully, like 6 months later, they published everything that they found on these suspected agents, not only including their hacking gear, but also the taxi receipt from an address in Moscow to Sheremetyevo Airport, and then rather helpfully, the Dutch published next to it the Google Maps image of where that taxi was taken from, which was just outside the main headquarters building of Russian military intelligence. Because we live in a sad world where even the top spies, the James Bonds and the Blofelds of this world, they need to get their taxi receipts, right? You've got to expense this stuff. That is still, now that the Dutch have published it, that is open source. And that is the most beautiful piece of open source you can get. How do we know they were spies from Russian military intelligence? Because we have the taxi receipt. It's beautiful.
So let's go back to Sherlock for a minute. Like I said earlier, the guy was a misanthrope. He generally did not like other human beings. Thankfully, the stories were raised in many ways by the fact of the partnership that he had with Dr. Watson. And whether the recreations of the story in film and on TV were particularly good or in some cases particularly awful, the bond there was always very important. But yet, I would imagine if Holmes himself had a choice, he'd rather be working alone. It's basically how he thought, how he processed information. He didn't want to be bothered. And that's a bit of a problem if you think about it, because while all of us have some of these tendencies at one level or another, it's very easy to get isolated in our work and lose connections with the peers in the broader community who can potentially strengthen what we do and be stronger than just the sum of our parts. So you have to ask yourself, how can you scale Sherlock? Interestingly, if you go back to the Sherlock stories, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle actually made some attempts to do this in very subtle ways. So we'd like to introduce you to this character. This is from one of the 1960s versions of Sherlock Holmes, the BBC TV version. Rather shady-looking guy.
And this is a gentleman who's known as Mr. Barker. He doesn't have a first name that we know of. He's just Mr. Barker. For those of you who are Sherlock Holmes geeks, this is in The Retired Colour Man, which is one of the later Sherlock Holmes stories. What we know about Mr. Barker to start with is that he's a sinister man in sinister dark glasses. You have to remember that for Victorians, somebody who was actually wearing dark glasses was probably a drug dealer right away. He's not just sinister, but as we know from the film, if the film runs.
And here we see Dr. Watson. I mean, yeah, you can kind of understand that response. So, Mr. Barker. Interestingly, if you had to ask Sherlock himself,
who is Mr. Barker? Sherlock actually replied, he is my hated rival upon the Surrey shore. For those of you who are not used to London, Surrey is kind of the South Bank where decent people don't actually go. So a little bit of snobbery from Sherlock Holmes there. But he's talking about his rival. He's not talking about Moriarty, the great rival, the Napoleon of crime. He's talking about something different. He's talking about a professional rival.
And interestingly, their rivalry was so strong that in at least one story, they didn't have any compunction against, well, frankly, arresting each other. I just I love how he hovers like that with those sunglasses of his. And so, yeah, he was his hated rival, but it was more than that.
This is my friend, Mr. Barker. When Holmes actually introduces Barker at the denouement, when they're working out who really done it, he introduces Barker not just to Watson, but to the police inspector. And the line that Holmes says in the book is, he has some very creditable cases to his name, doesn't he, Inspector? And the inspector gets a bit sniffy about him and says, well, yes, because he uses methods that the police don't. But Barker is a professional rival, but he's also a professional friend, and he's a colleague. And in The Retired Colour Man, Holmes and Barker work together to solve the case.
And let's face it, Sherlock needed friends. The guy didn't exactly have many. And while we get to see some of the relationship he has form and sour and form again in the various stories and adaptations, one of the biggest reasons why he needed friends was the simple fact that the guy was a burnout. Think of all the stories that we've seen among the Sherlock stories about his drug problems, or about the way he would isolate himself for days or weeks at a time, absorbed into one simple issue that he didn't want anyone else to address. In some ways, there are aspects of PTSD-like symptoms in how he would behave sometimes. And I say that as someone who has been diagnosed with PTSD because of the work that I've done doing open source journalism and open source research. And so I have some sympathies for the man. And it's also allowed me to understand that for those of us who do feel isolated sometime in this space, we have to constantly remind ourselves that there is strength in numbers. I mean, just look around the room right now. Think of all the places we're from. Just as a show of hands, how many of you are here from Europe? I imagine most of you, right?
Okay. We're counting Britain as Europe for the purpose
for the time being.
Okay.
How many are here from North America? South America? Asia? Africa? Australia and the Pacific? We know there are a few of you out there, just I'm not seeing you right now. No Antarctica, sadly. But nonetheless, strength in numbers. And as the example of Sherlock and Mr. Barker shows, yeah, we can be rivals sometimes, but competition is good. It brings out the best in us when we're working on projects and want to do what we can, perhaps one-up our colleagues occasionally, perhaps get the scoop before they do. But I would make the argument that cooperation is better, and on top of that, community is best. And the reason for that is pretty simple. We're in the middle of a cat and mouse game right now, and I don't like admitting it, but we're not the cat. We are constantly trying to figure out ways of figuring out how disinformation works, who's doing it, how do we expose it, and while we're at it, the bad actors are creating new methodologies, new strategies, new personas, and it's a cycle that goes and goes and goes around. So I don't always find it very useful to think of it as a war against disinformation. I think it's more like we have to figure out ways of mitigating it. And to mitigate it, we have to go beyond the people in this room. It's not just up to us. It has to involve a broader public of people. We need to have more people, whether they're civil society actors, policymakers, especially the general public, developing further digital fluency. Some people use the term digital literacy, but I like the term fluency instead. This whole idea of understanding how tools work, how the media works, how information comes together, and how it can be manipulated. We need more healthy skepticism. We need the public better understanding how to know how to be safe online. And they have to be civically engaged. It's not enough to just be online and trying to do good for yourself. It has to be more than that now. And if you take it all together, I think just perhaps we might be in a position to help develop a certain amount of digital resilience within our societies, because disinformation is a public health threat.
When I was growing up, part of my growing up was done in Yorkshire, back in the late 1970s. And there were a lot of people around then who still remember the days where on the buses, on the public transport system in Yorkshire, you still had no spitting signs. There was an entire campaign. Yorkshire was a rough place, right? There was an entire campaign. And it was not simply for public appearance or public decency, it was because of the spread of tuberculosis. There was a real public health issue going on. And there was a campaign against it, and it was a broad strokes campaign. You had health treatments, you had education treatments, you had different parts of the population being given different treatments depending on what they were actually dealing with. And we can actually think of the whole disinformation problem set in the same way. There isn't a single audience. There isn't a single set of people who are all going to behave the same way. Some people are already infected, some people have natural resistance, some people need inoculation. You need to stop the source of the infection from spreading it, and you need to catch the vectors. So there are lots of different parts of the puzzle, and just as public health requires lots of different pieces of the puzzle to work together, it's exactly the same setup with disinformation.
And so if you want to continue that metaphor and think about how we all inoculate ourselves and develop that type of herd resistance to disinformation, I think one of the only ways we're going to be able to do it is by having the public understand and embrace the idea that fighting disinformation is essentially a civic duty now. Just like voting, just like participating in local community political activities, serving on community arts boards, working with your school district. All of these things are extremely important for the health of our communities. But with disinformation lurking all around us in one form or another, we need to figure out how to fit this into the equation as well. It's absolutely important, it's vital, because we're more than just an industry, we're more than just a collection of industries. We're a community. We're a community of open source advocates, researchers, technologists. We're a movement, but first and foremost, we're digital Sherlocks. Thank you very much. So we've got a little time for questions. Do we have the mic runners running around yet? Any questions? Got one over here.
So I'm Sebastian, I'm from NATO Stratcom COE. How should we look at the future of digital Sherlocks? We're seeing social media platforms clamping down on our access, Facebook Graph API being one of the latest casualties here, so to say. What will happen in the 2 years to come? How will we keep up the pace, and how will we make sure that we can continue doing this work?
Well, I think we're in a tough situation right now because the platforms are trying to balance out protecting the public, clamping down on potential vectors for disinformation, but at the same time, we need to figure out how we can access this stuff. And so what may be useful for parts of the population isn't necessarily useful or very productive for us. So that's why having conversations like this are really important. Not having adversarial relationships in every way and always having knee-jerk reactions to decisions that are made. We got to work our way through it. And when it comes for new generations of digital Sherlocks, there are so many tools out there, so many spaces where open source research and open source software development are happening, the GitHubs of the world, where there are 12 and 13-year-old kids sitting in front of their laptops at home coming up with some sort of code to scrape something they probably shouldn't be scraping, and yet we're going to learn something powerful from it. So we've got to figure out, how do we encourage them? How do we tell them that, yeah, you may not want to violate the terms of service that way, but we can still find a way to encourage you to put this to best use? How do we mentor them and connect them with members of our community that can help raise them up and develop the next generation of digital Sherlocks? I honestly don't have all the answers yet, but I think developing networks of mentors and an ongoing system of capacity building where we can train and encourage young people, integrate them into the community, and find the best of them to do the same with their peers that are coming up as well. That's how you turn this into a movement.
And one other thought, if you think back in 2016, in early 2016, those of us who were in this space were desperately trying to ring the bell and say, hey, there's this whole election interference thing going on. 95% of people had never heard of it, 5% had heard of it, didn't care. Whatever else we say about 2019 and 2020, I think we can safely say people have now heard of the problem. And that's a really good start. I think we had a question over here, and then I think we're
Can
going
you
to...
hear me? Okay.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Nafiz Ahmed from Unitas Communications. I have just a really quick question about, really, I mean, thank you so much for the presentation. What I was worried about is the extent to which actors like RT and other kind of disinformation outlets have moved into this, moved so deeply into the public conversation space around things like Syria, for example, to the point that if the Atlantic Council, this is what we're seeing now in social media, where the Atlantic Council will put out corrective information in relation to chemical weapons claims, blah, 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 and there is now an organic response as a result of years of kind of this information that's been put out from RT, where you have a bad name. If you're at the Atlantic Council, there are huge communities of people now who automatically say, well, you're the Atlantic, you guys are just a CIA mouthpiece, blah, blah, blah. So the challenge I'm seeing is how do we counter that with a similar kind of organic movement? And I think you did mention this idea of training people up, but I think there is this really entrenched problem of how we engage with, especially kind of left-wing liberal critical thought, which is ideally supposed to be holding truth to power, which has now been essentially hijacked. How do we get into that space and kind of move away from this binary kind of, this is who we are, accusations of political bias, that kind of thing?
Sure. So something we have seen in a lot of fields, and Syria is a very good case study, Ukraine is another. There's a consistency of attack from the disinformation actors, banging the same drum day after day after day after day after day. And it's the repetition which really counts. And there are lots of different studies which show that in a lot of full stories, repetition itself comes to stand, it almost stands in for credibility. If you've heard it enough times, you start referencing it yourself. This is one of the big parts of the problem set. The advantage the hostile actors have had so far is they've effectively been working in a clear space, because they'll bang the same drum for day after day. The real media will actually be doing their job, which is to pick up the different stories and see what's happening. I think what we're seeing now is that there is the growing realization that that is an issue and that that is a problem, and that you need to repeat the truth as well. They repeat the lies ad nauseam. The truth needs to get the same kind of repetitive treatment. We need to keep on pushing the facts out there. And that's one area where the more people who are actually aware of what the facts are and are willing to share them and are willing to engage and are willing to say, yeah, I know you've seen that, but actually here are 9 million tweets in a database which shows that this is what they were actually doing. It's building the critical mass. The hostile actors have already built the critical mass. On our side, on the open source side, we don't have the critical mass yet, but one of the big challenges, therefore, to build that mass out. And that's what events like this are meant to help doing.
We've got time for one more question, so hands up, please. I want to find someone who hasn't asked a question already. Right back there, please.
Hi, I'm Aaron. I'm a reporter. I have a quick question. What recommendations would you provide large media outlets, multi-billion-dollar companies that are out there that have large media stamps? What type of recommendations would you provide them for better framing this type of work and to do more of it as original reporting within their newsrooms?
So I think there's been a lot of progress in the last few years of more news organizations embracing fact-checking in one form or another, and I think that's wonderful. At the same time, I would argue bad actors have gotten very good at countering fact-checking or creating fact-checking of their own that just muddies the waters. What I'd love to see more news organizations doing is looking at the bigger picture. And there are certainly ones out there that are doing it. BuzzFeed, for example, their team in Canada, I think, is extraordinary at looking at this stuff. But by looking at the big picture, understanding who the actors are, what their methodologies are, how the information spreads. So if there are certain times where a bit of information is flowing in ways that seem unusually viral, and it's requiring a significant fact check, I wouldn't want news organizations to simply answer whether it's true or not and then just move on to the next check. Invest the time instead to dig in, explain what's going on, and see themselves as having a civic duty of their own to educate their viewers, listeners, readers to better understand how to be skeptical in a healthy way, how to understand how the entire world of media and technology is connected, how it relates to different state actors and others. And so the next time they themselves stumble upon something, they might be a little less likely to hit the retweet button or the share button on Facebook or however they choose. So I think it's incumbent upon news organizations to be a part of solving this problem too. It's not enough to just fact check anymore.
And the one thing I'd add to that, I absolutely agree with that. Again, we can go back to Sherlock Holmes. Why do people read Sherlock Holmes stories? It's not for the dry facts, it's for the storytelling. It is a Sherlock Holmes story. And you're looking for that story, and you're not looking for whodunit. Ultimately, you're looking for that last bit of the story when Holmes is sitting down explaining to poor innocent Watson, here's all the clues you missed that I got. Next time, maybe you can do better, Watson. So there's a way you can actually tell these stories like a detective story. You're not just saying what was done, but you're actually showing people how the trick was done. And that makes for a really compelling story, and hopefully next time they'll learn so that they can spot it themselves.
So we have to wrap this up. Thank you very much.